Our next speaker is Natarajan, who will be speaking about Superposition, a flexible, safe, and yet powerful open source configuration management system. Natarajan is a software architect at Justpay Technologies. He has about 20 years of experience in designing, building, and operating large scale software systems. He is interested in building end to end systems that solve sharp problems. Currently at JustPay, he works as a horizontal architect across teams, helping building platforms that multiple teams can leverage to solve big rock problems. So, give it a huge round of applause for Natarajan.
Hey, good afternoon. Thanks everyone for taking the time and coming over for this talk. So my name is Natarajan. I work at Justpay Technologies as a software architect. And I'll be talking about something that we've built at Justpay and we've open sourced, and we believe it will be useful for the software community at large. It's basically a system called Superposition. It's a context-aware configuration management system. Okay, so we'll start off with some questions. How many of you change your configurations in production without really deploying your application? Just a show of hands. Okay, and I can see about 10, 12 hands. Fine. And how many of you have broken production while doing some configuration change like that? I mean, that's more than the first question, so it's okay, fine. So the follow-up question, how many of you, so one of the reasons for why we break is probably we don't check for correctness. So how strict are you with checking the correctness of your configuration before you actually roll it out into production? Do you check them very strictly, or it's so and so, things can go right, things can go wrong? Show of hands. Okay. And the last question, how many of you do you do your configuration changes as binary flips? It's like it's off and the next second it's on, or for all of your traffic, or do you slowly change them? Okay, 1% of my users see the new configuration, 2%, 10, 20, 60, 100. Do you do a slow stagger, right? That's what we refer to as staggering your configuration change. Do you do that, or do you just flip it binary? It's one value in 1 second and it's the another value in another second. Anyone does staggering of configuration changes? Okay, cool. Because this sets the context for why we ended up building Superposition. But before this, right, the most obvious answer once you do all of this is, okay, I could use a database to manage my configurations, right? That's the most standard definition, right? Okay, because I can hold configuration in a database, I can change it without deploying an application, it's easy. But then a normal database doesn't come with a lot of features. So, for example, right, checking for correctness is not a very straightforward thing, right? The most basic thing for correctness is the type of the configuration, right? Whether you want an integer or you want a string. And if it's a string, then maybe you can go to the next level. If it's an enum, it should follow a particular pattern. Maybe database semantics would probably give you ability to check a lot of these things, right? Till maybe about an enum, maybe even patterns, right? But if you want to do deep checks, right? You probably will need some sort of an API to do deep checks, right? If, for example, right, you may have a URL as a configuration value, right? At JustPay, we do have URLs for a lot of things. The classic case maybe you need a logo image somewhere. Now, it's very easy for someone, and the validation that you can typically put on the database level is it has to be a string, maybe it has to start with HTTPS, and maybe end with JPEG and PNG or whatever, right? Maybe you can put that kind of validation. But a real validation is you want to know that the URL exists, right? If the URL really doesn't exist, you don't want to set that as a configuration value. And we've made mistakes on this. We've put URL changes which didn't even exist. Just because someone pasted it in Slack, there was a typo, it looked like a URL, obviously, you copy paste, just boom, right? We broke production. And as you grow big as a company, right, and a lot of other companies, and particularly when a lot of consumers depend on you, you can't afford to make these mistakes. It becomes extremely costly when you make these mistakes. So a database will not allow you to do all of these checks, right? Yeah, then what's the next option, right? You probably push this into your application logic, into your APIs. But then what that makes is whenever you have to add a new configuration, I mean, you literally have to add you have to add some application code or an API code to ensure that those checks happen. So those are challenges that are typically there. So checking for correctness is a much wider problem than what it typically seems to be. Similarly, just as we talked about the case of staggering an experiment or staggering a configuration change, you can't, typically you just can't use the database to do a rollout, right? You can't ask a database saying, maybe you can drive a random number and then store two values and show one value and another value, right? Maybe you can do some funky stuff with the database to do that, but it's not a native feature that a database really supports, right? But as you grow big, it's staggering configurations become pretty much inevitable, right? Now, in fact, within JustPay, it's almost, it's a written rule, unwritten rule. All changes have to be staggered, whatever be the system. It's not just for code, right? Even for, I think applications probably you'll be familiar, right? You'll have blue-green deployments. You'll slowly start sending traffic from one stack or one deployment to another. So staggering is also an extremely important feature that a configuration system has to support, right? And that's typically not available in a typical database, basic database API solution. There's another use of configuration, another expectation from configuration systems, particularly in SaaS software. How many of you build SaaS software? When I say SaaS, I'll probably define, right? You build one piece of software and then you kind of have multiple customers use it, typically through a web interface. How many of you do SaaS? Yeah. So a lot of you, right? So it's a very classic, and not all of them have all features enabled, right? You'll have some features enabled for some groups of customers and some other features enabled. And a lot of customers will share groups, right? So for example, if you take the case of JustPay has merchants and banks, right? So merchants are cohorts. You will have insurance merchants, you will have e-commerce merchants, you will have gaming merchants, and a lot of them have similar configuration requirements, right? And you may typically want to change the configuration for these cohorts kind of together. And at the same time, you want a lot of configuration to be inherited across your merchants as well, right? So a typical database-based configuration system, you tend to replicate your configs. So you will replicate it for each customer. So if you have to go and do a change across all your customers, you probably have to go and edit each record, right? So there's no hierarchical mechanism where you can actually have some configs flow through your entire set of customers based on different attributes, right? So that's also a typical requirement that's not satisfied by a standard API database kind of combination. You can always build something on top of it, but that doesn't come out of box from a standard database offering. So we had all of these problems at JustPay. So, and we had this not just in one team, we had this across teams, right? We had this problem across the front-end teams, we had this problem across the back-end teams. I don't know how many of you were at the Namayatri talk in the morning when Max talked. When we started different units of business within JustPay, they also needed, they needed a lot of configuration, right? So if you take the case of Namayatri is operating in multiple cities in India, right? They're not running 10 different stacks, they're running the same stack, but the configuration needs of what's there in Tumkur versus what's needed in Bangalore is completely different. So at JustPay, one thing that we are encouraged to do strongly is to do a first principles approach, right? So we saw all of these problems. So what did we do at that point? So we said, okay, let's define what a configuration system should do, right? And so that we can build for that, right? So we went back and then we said, what is a configuration system supposed to do? Right? We should be able to define configurations, right? And by configuration, I mean it's a key and a value, right? It's key and a value. That's the general meaning. But we wanted to be very specific, particularly when we said we wanted to be correct, right? The value just doesn't have to be value, it has to be a typed value, right? So that's where we decided the definition of a configuration is basically a key and a typed value. And we also wanted, particularly because a lot of our software is catering to a SaaS kind of setup, we wanted to be able to override configurations under certain domain contexts, right? We deliberately worded this as particular domain context because we didn't want to build something for the payments or something just for the ride-hailing business, right? So The domain could be anything. It could be an e-commerce domain, or it could be a gaming domain, or an insurance domain. So you may be able to change your configurations based on your domain. Right? So this is what we wanted to capture the core requirement of a configuration system into one line, right? And this is what we came up with. And if you really see, all the features that we build, or the core of the system actually revolves around this definition, because we wanted to get this definition right. And then that's the configuration system, right? That's the basic requirement of a configuration system. Then on top of it, we also wanted to make sure that all configuration changes are always experimented with before they are released. When you're saying release, we are saying general availability, right? It's available for all the customers. So they have to be experimented with. I mean, what do we mean by experimented with, right? We just saw that earlier in the talk, right? So you want to expose it to a small set of customers. Look at your metrics. Are you doing okay? Okay, if it's looking okay, you probably dial it up, right? It should be okay or better, right? I mean, you can't regress your metrics, right? Like for example, like a company like JustPay, there are a lot of merchants relying on us. We can't ever drop the payment success rate ever. So any change, right? We have to always keep monitoring our success rates so that they don't go down. So every configuration change has to be experimented with. So you have to release configuration changes by doing experiments, and you never go and flip configuration values. When you're a very small startup and you're doing a 0 to 1, probably fine. When your customer base is small, fine. When they're forgiving, it's fine. But when you grow big, experimentation just becomes, I mean, it's inevitable, right? And it's not even an option. You just have to do it. So these two slides kind of capture the core requirements of what we set out to build. Right? And that's how we ended up with what we call as superposition. So it's kind of a play on the icon at least. Okay, so the name is basically a play on the fact that the configuration values are superimposed on one on the other. So you will see there's a base value, and then you put something on top of it for a particular context, and then so your configuration value depends on the context at which you are looking at. And then that's basically Schrodinger's cat sitting inside a box with like a killing mechanism inside. So you never know whether the cat is alive or dead till you actually open the box. So it's the same with configs also. You don't know the value of the configuration till you actually supply a context and say, for example, in the case of Namayatri, give me the per kilometer rate for Bangalore, right? I mean, you just don't ask, give me the per kilometer rate. There's no context. There's no meaning for that question in the Namayatri application. You always have to say which city you're operating in, right? So that's where the context kind of comes in. Right? So that's a brief bit about the icon and the name of the project. So if you really see, it's a context-based configuration management system designed to facilitate safe and flexible rollout of configuration changes. Now, it has two components to it, two separate services. There's one part which is called the context-aware config service, and then there's another one called experimentation service. The context-aware config service is the foundational configuration management system. The experimentation system sits on top of it and manages your experiments using the context-aware config service. So this is the one that lets you do the granular configuration of data, right? Just like what I told. So it allows you to do Bangalore rate is 15 rupees per kilometer, Tumkur maybe it's 10 rupees per kilometer, right? That's what context-aware config lets you do. So if you see, this is and I don't know how many of you are Rust users here, Rust developers. So you will probably look at, you may be familiar with this format, right? It's the TOML format. So there is a CAC, the configuration format which is built on top of the TOML format. This is how it looks like. So you can actually, it's very readable, right? So the first section, which is called the default config, lists out all the possible configurations in your system. Right? So in this case, we are saying for the Namayatri kind of application, there's a per kilometer rate whose default value is 20. And the schema, that's where the type comes in, right? One part of the type comes in. So it says the type has to be a number, right? And then there's a surge factor. Typically based on traffic, you may increase the rates. Right? And the dimensions are city, it's Bangalore and Delhi in this example. Vehicle type could be auto, cab, and bike. For those of you who didn't know, Namayatri also operates cabs in Bangalore, the same subscription model. So please do use it. It's not just autos. And then there's the hour of day as a dimension, right? Because you may want to tweak the rate that you charge based on the hour of the day. So the next 4 things are basically contextual overrides. I think if you read it itself, you'll kind of get it. So you'll say when the vehicle type is cab, my per kilometer rate is not 20, but it's 25. When the vehicle type is bike, obviously the per kilometer rate has to go down, right? I mean, it's 15. And then when it's Bangalore and auto, the per kilometer rate is 22. And then maybe in Delhi, there is a peak hour between 12 and 6 o'clock in the evening, you have a surge factor of 5%. So this is how roughly what a CAC configuration kind of looks like, right? So there are default configs. So the set of all configurations that your application needs. There are dimensions, which are basically business contexts, which govern for different values of which your configurations will change. And then there are a bunch of expressions and corresponding overrides that are there. Right? This is essentially, in a nutshell, what context-aware configuration is, right? That's your configuration setup set, and then this is all the context-based overrides for all your configuration. And if you notice, so this has been hugely inspired by how CSS works. So there is also, so there are a lot of matching rules, right? The same configuration is override. Both of them are sometimes multiple rules can match and all of it. So we do prioritize the dimension order by implicitly gives them a priority. So the hour of the day is has highest weight than vehicle type than the city. So in case you are wondering which one takes precedence, each of them get a weight, and the weight of an expression eventually is the sum of the weights of all of the conditions that are there. So that's how the context is disambiguated at runtime. So this is in a nutshell how context-aware config looks like. I've shown you a TOML version of it, but we actually have a full-fledged API service backed by a database and all of it, which is more practical in a normal SaaS application. So, but this is easier to explain, so that's the reason why I resorted to the TOML. So the next one is the next part, right? The next component of Superposition is the experimentation system, which lets you do the A/B deployments, right? Which lets you do 2 variations. So you have per kilometer rate as 22, and then you want to do an experiment saying, if I raise it to 23, will my ride hailing go down, right? So you can do an experiment. You don't want to turn it to 23 and then see people not using your service itself, right? So you can do that. And it's not just for A/B, it allows you to do N variants at the same time, right? So you can do 22, 23, 24, 25, so that because you want to evaluate the behavior of all of these configs at the same point in time. And it also allows you to dial up these experiments or dial down these experiments fairly easily. Okay, so we talked about the A/B releases, we talked about type and validation support. So on top of validation support, we also realized that, right, things like the URL check that we talked about, right, is not easily possible by any off-the-box system. So we also added function validation support. So you can literally write JavaScript functions to run additional validations in a very controlled sandbox environment, which even has an HTTP client. So typically you would want to check some values against a database or against an API or for some reason. So we do allow sandboxed functions to run additional validations on configuration values. So Superposition comes with a rich API support. Every action in Superposition has a corresponding API, right? It becomes very, very practical because particularly in this age of ML and AI, you may have a lot of your weights decided by ML models and things like that, and you want to update your configuration values quickly back. So there's rich API support for every action that's there. It is out of the box multi-tenant, so which means that one deployment of a context-aware Superposition system will allow you to create separate tenants for your front-end team, for your back-end team, for your database team, for your operations team, or for everyone, right? So it makes it very easy for a single deployment to have isolated configuration management for all of your teams. It comes with an admin UI. I'll quickly take you through the admin UI. So that it pretty much allows you to do all operations that you need in a Superposition setup. It also comes with a performant client. So all of this, we can't, JustPay serves a lot of, we do close to, more than, close to 1 crore transactions per day, right, in terms of volume. So it's very hard to do, you can't do API calls to go and get configuration values, right? It has to be in memory. You probably want to even go out of the box. It has to be in memory, it has to be fast because config lookups are going to be sprinkled across the code base, right? So there is a client that comes along with Superposition, which basically caches in an async manner on your pods, so that you don't incur a cost of going out of the box for doing config lookups, right? And it also does the resolution of all the configurations on the client. So Superposition does not just come with the service, but it also comes with a client which is tuned for high performance applications. So we are live in production. A lot of JustPay teams are using it. Namayatri is using it heavily. So it's not just software that we've built out and it's just sitting in GitHub, but it is heavily used. I'll quickly walk you through the demo app. It's okay. So I don't have enough time for the demo app, but yeah. So this is basically an app that was basically I was talking about the same thing, right? So you could actually have. I'm switching the city. You will see the logo change. You will see the language change. You will see the rates change and all of it. But more importantly, I think what's more important is the admin UI, right? So the admin UI, I don't know how clear it is. It's probably a little stretched out. Is it better? I don't know. Okay, I don't know how clear it is. Okay, but this is the default configuration screen, right? So this is where a list of all configurations are there. So I just want to show a single. So for example, there is this logo, right, for the city that we've added logos. So if you can't really see, there's a key name, there's a schema. I don't know if I make it big, if it's going to be better. Yeah, it's a little better. So then you have a default value, and then if you really see, there's a function assigned at the bottom of it, right? There's a function says Axios validator example at the bottom. Now, what does this function do? You will actually see that this function, let me just do this. This function basically is a simple 200 check, right? So now if I go and try to change, so I already have a pattern for this saying, this has to be of this pattern, right? That takes care of some part of the typing of the configuration. But that's not enough. Now, for example, if I go ahead and change this, right? Let me just remove, okay, let me add a couple of things so that the URL becomes invalid, right? Now, if I submit this, I don't know if I'm still on the network. Does it work? Oh, it did. Maybe, I think the network failed. The validation should have ideally kicked in and failed this change because that was not a 200 OK response. So that's the level of validation that you can do at a single key, right? And then you have the definition of functions. I'll quickly show the experimentation page. So this is where you actually manage your experiments. You can create an experiment. Let me see if I can quickly. So you basically are running an experiment for the cab setup. You're saying my base rate is already 25 for cabs, but I want to run an experiment where I'm saying it's 30 for cabs, right? So you can create an experiment and then you can start ramping the experiment, keep monitoring your metrics, and then you can either conclude whether you want to go back to your value that was there based on the metrics or you want to go with the newer value, right? So that kind of showcases the experimentation setup. There are everything that you can do is available here. There are type templates, there are debugging mechanisms here. But definitely give it a shot. So we have a booth outside in the JustPay area. So if you want to learn more about Superposition, definitely stop by so that you'll get a more deeper insight. I'll quickly wrap up after I come back to the slides. Okay. So the crew, there are a lot of folks who have helped us. I think, yeah, Ankit, Ayush, Karthik, Pratik, Ritik, Saurav, and Subhranshu, plus a bunch of folks, without which I think this would not have been possible. And I think, in a way, all of us are fortunate that thanks to JustPay, right, we are able to do open source software as part of our day job, right? It's generally not that easy to do, where your work itself is open source, right? And we are extremely grateful and thankful for JustPay to be supporting us this way, where we can solve problems for JustPay at the same time take those solutions and offer it out. So please do stand by visit our booth, and there's the Namayatri stall on the first floor as well. So definitely stop by our booths. We are actively hiring across multiple teams inside JustPay. So you can definitely talk to folks who are at the booth. And this is the repository. So GitHub JustPay Superposition. You can scan it. You can get in there, and we are on Twitter as well. So yeah, I think I'm done. Any questions? Please go ahead. No, okay. So you don't have to. So the UI that I showed, you can actually use the UI to do the change. The code was just a representation for you to explain the process. So there's a code representation of it. There's also an admin UI through which you can actually change. So it will reflect on your application. So you don't need to do it. You can choose to do it. So some people, they may want to do all changes via just a Git kind of flow model. Then you can use the file. But in a very practical application, you might want an admin UI. Particularly when you have operations persons who are not technical, right? They may not be able to comfortable changing code. So you may want to give them a UI which is tight and secure.
Okay.
Any other questions? Okay, I think there's one more we can take. Sorry, how? Okay, good question. So metrics is a part, I think even if you look at a README, right? Metrics is a part that we have not fully integrated yet. So so that's one part that's missing actually. That's the third. So you saw two parts that we said, right? We said context aware and experimentation, right? So currently the onus is on the applications to actually take the experimentation information and log it along with their business flows, so that each data point that the businesses generate have the information, whether it is from variant A of an experiment or from variant B of an experiment. So that is still an expectation from the application. We can't really do anything about it. We'll tell you in which bucket you fill in, but the application has to kind of annotate the transaction or the record with that information, and then it should come up in your metric system. So we are building that currently. So you should see a metrics system so that in your experiment, right, we just don't want, if you saw this page, it didn't have any performance related information about both the variants. So we want to surface the performance metrics here so that you can take a call on this. Today in JustPay, you'll have to go to another system, see, and then come back, but we will close the circuit there.
Okay. Thank you so much, Natarajan, for such an insightful session. If you have further questions,